A woman sprinted along the canyon rim, rain whipping across her face as she raised a rifle and fired 3 shots into the storm. Far below, families abandoned their homes and ran uphill as a brown wall of water appeared between the cliffs, carrying trees, boulders, and pieces of buildings toward them. Another rifle answered downstream. Then a farm bell began screaming through the valley. Men grabbed their children. Women drove terrified sheep toward higher ground. An elderly couple stumbled along the ridge, while the roar behind them grew deep enough to shake the earth beneath their boots. The woman turned toward a narrow path cut into the sandstone. 30 feet above the canyon floor, a wooden doorway stood almost invisible inside the cliff. People began climbing toward it. Then one man appeared below. Months earlier, he had laughed at the shelter hidden in that rock. Now his farm was disappearing behind him, and the water was gaining fast. She stood at the mouth of the hillside shelter, with her back against stone that had been carved by water older than memory. Below her, a wall of brown fury tore through Boxelder Canyon, ripping apart every structure built on the valley floor. Behind her, 17 neighbors pressed together in the space she had carved from sandstone, the space they had called foolish. 6 months earlier, the space they had called a waste of good lumber. The space one man had publicly declared proof that grief could ruin a woman's judgment. That man was among them now, sitting against the rear wall, with his face in his hands, listening to the sound of his 12-year empire being ground into splinters by water that did not care how successful he had been. But this moment belongs later in the telling. The flood that proved everything came 14 months after. The flood that destroyed everything. So the story must begin where Temperance Whitfield's life split into before and after, not in the canyon, but in a city she would never see again. Providence, Rhode Island, in the winter of 1881, smelled like wet wool, coal smoke dying. The Whitfield house on Cranston Street sat between a boarding house for mill workers on the east side, a cooperative that had gone silent 2 years prior on the west. Insides, the furniture their father had built filled every room with the evidence of a craftsman's life, dovetailed drawers that slid without sound, a dining table with legs turned on the lathe he kept in the basement, chairs joined so precisely that 30 years of use had not loosened a single rung. Edmund Whitfield built furniture the way some men wrote poetry, with an obsessive attention to the invisible. He cared about the joints no one would see, the undersides no one would touch, the way wood moved, with seasons swelling in humid summers, contracting in dry winters, because he believed that what held things together mattered more than what people noticed on the surface. He died in April of 1881, his lungs filled with the slow accumulation of sawdust from 3 decades of breathing his craft. He was 54 years old. His daughter Temperance Mercy, to everyone who knew her, had spent 18 years in that basement workshop. Not as an apprentice, because daughters were not apprentices. As something without a name. She handed him tools before he asked for them. She learned to read grain direction by running her fingers across raw lumber. She understood why a mortise cut across the grain held differently than one cut with it. She knew that white oak resisted moisture better than red, that black walnut carved cleanly but split if you rushed, that pine forgave mistakes but never forgot them warping years later to remind you of every careless cut. Her father had told her once, while she held a board steady for his saw, that she would have made a fine engineer if the world allowed women to be engineers. He said this without bitterness or apology, the way he might have observed that walnut stained darker than maple. A fact. She was 24 years old when he died, old enough to understand that the compliment contained its own prison. Her mother, Constance, survived Edmund by 5 months. Not illness in the clinical sense, exhaustion that deepened into something the doctor called decline, a word that described the direction without explaining the cause. Constance Whitfield had run the household, managed the accounts, negotiated with suppliers, handled every aspect of life that existed outside the basement workshop. Without Edmund, the structure she had maintained for 30 years lost its purpose. She stopped eating in July. She stopped leaving her bedroom in August. She died in September, folded into herself like a letter no one would read. Mercy's brother Josiah handled the arrangements. He was 28, 3 years older, employed as a clerk at the Wanskuck textile mill. where he spent 10 hours daily recording production numbers, in ledgers that smelled of dye. He was good at the work in the way that a man can be good at something he despises, efficient, accurate, quietly furious. Josiah had their mother's social intelligence, the ability to read a room, to know what people needed to hear, to navigate conversations, the way their father navigated wood grain. Where Mercy observed objects, Josiah observed people. Where she asked why a joint held, he asked why a negotiation succeeded. They complemented each other with the unconscious precision of siblings who had grown up solving different halves of the same problems. The house sold in November. The furniture, their father's life work, went to a dealer on Westminster Street, who paid 40 cents on the dollar because he knew they were desperate. Mercy watched a stranger load her father's dining table onto a cart, the table where she had eaten every meal of her life, the table whose underside she had memorized as a child lying on the floor while her father worked. She did not cry. She memorized the moment instead, filing it alongside every other thing she had learned about what happened when circumstances had more power than sentiment. After debts, funeral costs, the discounted furniture, they held $180 between them. Josiah proposed going west on a Tuesday evening in December, sitting across from Mercy in the empty parlor of their rented room. His voice carried the particular energy of someone who had been thinking about escape for months, but needed permission to speak it aloud. Colorado Territory still had homestead land available, he told her. 160 acres for nothing but the filing fee, the promise to live on it, the willingness to work. Mercy asked what they knew about farming. Josiah admitted they knew nothing. She asked what they knew about Colorado. He admitted they knew less. She asked why he thought two people with no agricultural experience, no Western knowledge, limited funds could succeed, where, by all accounts, many experienced settlers failed. Josiah leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his clerk's hands clasped together. Because staying here is a slower way to die. The words were not dramatic in his mouth. They were arithmetic. Providence offered millwork, boarding houses, a life measured in someone else's production numbers. Colorado offered uncertainty, but uncertainty at least contained the possibility of something built rather than something endured. Mercy agreed that night, not because his argument was compelling, but because she had nothing to counter it with. Staying required a reason, a pull toward something specific in Providence that justified the daily diminishment of working for wages in a city that reminded her of funerals. She had no such reason. The workshop was someone else's now. The house belonged to strangers. Her parents existed only in the grain patterns of furniture, scattered across dealers' showrooms. Going west was not a dream. It was the absence of any reason to stay. They spent 3 months preparing with the methodical attention their parents had modeled. Josiah researched routes, supply requirements, territorial laws. Mercy studied what she could find about construction in arid climates, soil types, water management. They purchased a wagon, 2 mules, provisions calculated to last 6 months. Josiah bought a milk cow from a farmer in Warwick, 4 sheep from another in Scituate. Mercy packed her father's best hand tools, chisels, a brace with 6 bits, a draw knife, 2 saw, a square. She also packed his mercury thermometer, the one he had used to monitor workshop temperature, because wood moved differently at different temperatures. In Missouri, crossing through on the overland route, Josiah found the dog. A farmer's litter, shepherd crosses, 8 weeks old, the runt undersized, with a brindle coat, the color of dried creek mud. Josiah paid 50 cents for it, naming it Flint because the pup's eyes were the gray of struck stone. Mercy began training the animal immediately, teaching it to move around livestock without startling them, to respond to hand signals rather than shouted commands, to stay calm when hooves stamped near its head. The training was instinct for her. She understood what the dog needed, to learn the same way. She understood what a joint needed, to hold patience, repetition, the willingness to let the animal figure out the logic rather than forcing obedience through fear. By the time they reached Colorado Territory, Flint worked the sheep with quiet competence, circling wide, never nipping, holding position until Mercy's hand told him to move. They arrived at Boxelder Canyon in March of 1882, but 3 months after leaving Providence. The canyon opened before them like a wound in the earth, red sandstone walls, rising 200 feet on either side, narrowing as the drainage cut deeper into the plateau. The floor was flat, where multiple tributaries joined, widening into a valley, perhaps a quarter-mile across. A creek ran through the center, clear water over smooth stones, cottonwood trees lining its banks with a particular green that signaled reliable moisture. Josiah saw paradise. Flat ground for building, water that ran year-round, shade trees already grown, soil dark enough to promise a kitchen garden. He walked the valley floor with his long stride, pointing out where the cabin would stand, where the barn would go, where they would fence, pasture. His enthusiasm was infectious. In the way that confidence often substitutes for knowledge, he spoke about the future, as though he could see it fully formed, as though the only distance between intention and reality was labor. Mercy saw the same things but noticed something else. On their first afternoon, while Josiah paced the cabin site driving stakes into the ground, she stood beneath a cottonwood tree near the creek bank. The trunk was thick, 3 feet across at least, old enough to have witnessed decades of canyon weather. Halfway up the trunk, above her head by 2 feet, a line of dried mud clung to the bark. Not a splash or a streak, a line, horizontal, consistent, marking a level the way a carpenter's pencil marked a cut. Her eyes followed the line to adjacent trees. Each one carried the same mark at roughly the same height, 6-7 feet above the current creek level. She looked at the canyon walls nearby. Stains on the sandstone confirmed what the trees suggested. Water had risen here. Not the gentle seasonal fluctuations of eastern rivers, she understood, but something that had filled this valley floor to a depth that would have submerged the spot where Josiah was cheerfully driving his stakes. She called to him. He walked over, followed her pointing finger to the mudline. He studied it for a moment with his clerk's analytical eye, then shrugged. Spring snowmelt, he said. High water from the mountains during the thaw. Every river valley had seasonal flooding. It came, it receded, you built accordingly. He noted that the mudline was only 7 feet up, manageable. He suggested they could build a raised foundation if she was concerned. Mercy accepted his explanation because she had no better one. She did not understand desert hydrology. Neither of them did. They came from a place where rain soaked into soil, where rivers rose slowly over days, where flooding was a gradual event that allowed preparation. They had no framework for what a canyon could do with water, how it could collect rainfall from 50 square miles of watershed, concentrate it into a channel barely 100 yards wide, accelerate it through a narrow throat of rock with the compressed fury of something that had been building force for miles before it arrived. The mudline on the cottonwood was a sentence in a language neither of them could read. Later, Mercy would remember touching the dried mud with her fingertip, feeling its texture, noting that it was fine-grained and smooth, the signature of fast water, carrying suspended sediment, rather than the coarse grit of slow seasonal rise. The information was in her hand. She simply lacked the vocabulary to interpret. They built through spring into early summer, with the focused energy of people constructing their first permanent home. Josiah handled the heavy structural work, felling trees, squaring logs, digging post holes, lifting beams into position. Mercy handled joinery, the precise work that connected pieces into systems. She cut a mortise and tenon, joints for the doorframe, notched rafters at the correct angle for roof pitch, fitted window casings, with the patience her father had taught her. The work felt like conversation with the dead. Each joint technique, a phrase. Edmund Whitfield had spoken through demonstration rather than words. Their cabin took shape beside the creek, 30 yards from the water, built on level ground that required almost no grading. By mid-June, 3 months after arrival, the walls were complete, the roof half-finished, the interior framing underway. They had established a routine that divided labor without negotiation. Josiah rose first, fed the livestock, started whatever heavy task awaited. Mercy followed, handled milking, then moved to detail work on the cabin. Flint divided his attention between the sheep, grazing on canyon grass upstream, the humans working below. The dog had developed a habit of positioning himself on elevated ground, a boulder, a low ridge, the base of the canyon wall, where he could watch both the flock above him, the cabin below. Neither Mercy nor Josiah thought anything of it. The dog preferred high ground. Some animals did. The afternoon of June 18th began with thunder. Not unusual for late spring in Canyon, country moisture from the south collided with cooler air descending from the high plateau, producing storms that built rapidly, struck hard, moved on. By 2 o'clock, the sky above Boxelder Canyon had turned the color of an old bruise, purple-black with yellow edges where sunlight still penetrated. Rain fell in sheets, heavy enough to blur the canyon walls into red ghosts. Thunder cracked between the sandstone faces, each report multiplied by echoes into a rolling barrage that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. Josiah carried their tools under the completed roof section. Mercy followed with the hardware nails, hinges, bracket iron that could rust if left in the rain. They continued working on interior framing, trusting the partial roof to keep them dry while the storm passed. Rain drummed overhead with a steady intensity that suggested duration rather than violence. It felt like a soaking rain, the kind eastern farmers welcomed for its deep penetration. The creek began rising within 15 minutes. Neither of them registered this as abnormal, because neither of them had a baseline for what normal meant in a desert canyon during a summer storm. In Providence, a creek might rise an inch in an hour during heavy rain. In Boxelder Canyon, the same creek could rise a foot in minutes, because it was not receiving local rainfall alone. It was receiving the accumulated runoff of an entire watershed, miles of slick rock mesa where rain hit stone, sheeted off without absorption, poured into drainage channels, that fed into tributary canyons, that fed into the main channel, where two people from Rhode Island were building a cabin 30 yards from the bank. Josiah noticed the sound first. He stopped hammering, held the nail between his fingers, tilted his head, the way Flint tilted his when catching a distant noise. The sound was low, a vibration more felt than heard, like a loaded freight wagon rolling over cobblestones, but continuous growing, without the pauses between wheels that would identify it as human-made. It did not match the thunder still rumbling overhead. Thunder cracked in discrete reports. This sound built without breaking. He stepped out from under the partial roof into the rain, looked upstream toward the narrow throat, where the canyon constricted before opening into their valley. For a moment he saw nothing unusual: brown water running higher than normal. In the creek bed, rain dimpling the surface. Then the canyon wall on the far side disappeared behind a moving surface of brown. He shouted Mercy's name, not in anger, not in surprise. The flatness of his voice was what made her move, a quality she had never heard from her brother. The absolute absence of emotion that signified something beyond emotional range. She came out from under the roof into the rain, looked where he was looking. A wall of brown water 6 feet high, carrying entire cottonwood trees stripped of branches, boulders rolling in the current like pebbles. The debris of everything upstream that had not been anchored to bedrock. This wall was coming toward them with a speed that eliminated decision-making. There was no time to gather tools, food, the money pouch hanging from a nail inside the cabin. No time to think about the cow tied to a post near the creek. No time for anything, except the most primitive calculation the human brain can perform: the distance to safety versus the speed of death. Josiah grabbed Mercy's arm. They ran toward the canyon wall, the nearest solid geology, 25 yards east of the cabin. Mercy could see the sandstone face through the rain, vertical, pocked with shadows that might be handholds, a narrow ledge 15 feet up where the rock stepped back into a horizontal shelf. If they could reach the wall, find purchase, climb above the waterline, they might survive. 20 feet from the wall, the flood hit. The leading edge caught Josiah at the knees. The current was not water in any sense. Mercy understood from eastern streams. It was liquid geology, thick with suspended sand, heavy with dissolved earth, carrying enough solid debris to turn every surface it struck into a collision. Josiah went down as though his legs had been cut. His grip on Mercy's arm held for 1 second. 2 then, the force differential between his submerged body being dragged downstream, her partially exposed body, still moving toward the wall, exceeded the strength of fingers locked around at a wrist. His hand tore free. Mercy felt herself swept backward, tumbling in a churning darkness that had no up or down. Her shoulder struck something solid, a cottonwood trunk wedged between rocks, one of the trees she had examined for mudlines on their first day. She grabbed it with both hands, her fingers finding bark ridges that gave her purchase. The current tried to strip her loose, pulling at her legs. her torso, trying to fold her around the trunk. She held. She pulled herself partially above the surface, gasped air that tasted like mud, oriented herself. The canyon wall was 8 feet away. She could see the sandstone through the brown water. Streaming past, could see cracks, a protruding knob of harder rock, the ledge above. 8 feet of current separated her from survival. She released the cottonwood trunk. The water took her immediately, but she had aimed her release toward the wall, rather than downstream. She hit the sandstone face with her right side, felt the impact through her ribs, her hip, her elbow. Her hands found a crack, a vertical fissure in the rock face, where differential erosion had created a seam. She jammed her fingers in. Her boots scraped against the wall, found a small protrusion, pressed. She climbed. Fingers finding cracks her father's daughter, recognized as natural joints in the stone, places where sugars met, where softer material had eroded to leave edges her hands could grip. She pulled herself up the wall, with strength she did not know she possessed, the strength that exists only in the minutes when the body understands that stopping means death. She reached the ledge. 15 feet above the canyon floor, a horizontal shelf 2 feet wide, backed by an overhang that kept the rain off. She pulled herself onto it, lay flat gasping, her cheek pressed against sandstone that felt warm despite the storm. She looked back for Josiah. The canyon floor had become a river. Brown water filled the valley from wall to wall, 6 feet deep in the center, carrying the debris of their 3 months' work lumber, spinning in the current, their partial roof floating intact for a moment, before striking a boulder, breaking apart. Cow was gone. The sheep, she could not see the sheep, could not see any living thing in the water, except the trees still standing, their trunks submerged to the mud lines she had noticed on the first day, the lines that were no longer historical, but present tense. Josiah was nowhere. She screamed his name. The flood swallowed the sound the way it had swallowed everything completely, without echo, without acknowledgement. She screamed again. The water answered with the grinding roar of boulders, rolling along the canyon bottom, a sound like continuous thunder generated from below, rather than above. From somewhere above her, on the canyon rim, a bark, Flint. The dog had been on high ground when the flood arrived, up on the canyon slope with the sheep. Positioned on the elevated ground, he instinctively preferred. She could not see him through the rain, but the bark told her he was alive. He was above the water. He was calling to her, the way she was calling to Josiah, across a distance that sound could cross, but bodies could not. The flood receded in 3 hours. Not gradually, the way eastern rivers fell abruptly, as though someone had pulled a plug. The water level dropped from 6 feet to 3 feet in 20 minutes. From 3 feet to ankle depth in another 20. The speed of recession matched the speed of arrival, because the water had never belonged to this valley. It had been passing through on its way somewhere else, a transit of violence with no interest in staying. Mercy climbed down from her ledge when the water reached her shins. The canyon floor was unrecognizable. Scoured clean topsoil, stripped to bedrock in places, gravel deposits in others. Debris piled against every obstruction that had survived the current. Their cabin was gone. Not damaged, gone. The foundation post holes were filled with sand. Scattered lumber lay downstream, mixed with tree branches, dead brush, stones that had not been there that morning. The creek ran in a new channel, 15 feet east of its original course, as though the flood had rearranged the canyon's plumbing on its way through. She found Josiah a quarter-mile downstream, his body caught against a rock outcropping where the canyon narrowed. He lay face down in shallow water, his arms extended forward, as though he had been swimming, reaching for something ahead of him. She turned him over. His face was unmarked, no cuts, no bruises, visible beneath the coating of fine brown silt. He had drowned quickly. The water had filled his lungs before the rocks could break his bones. She sat beside him in the ankle-deep water. Flint came down from the canyon rim, picking his way through debris, 2 surviving sheep following at a cautious distance. The dog reached Mercy, pressed his wet body against her side, lay down next to her with his chin on Josiah's chest. The sheep stood 20 yards away, watching with the blank patience of animals that have survived something they will never understand. Mercy sat with her brother until dark. She did not speak to him, did not arrange his limbs, did not close his eyes. She simply sat, her hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth leave his body degree by degree, as the canyon shadows lengthened, as the evening air cooled, as the sky cleared to reveal stars she had never seen in Providence, dense, sharp, indifferent to the specificity of human loss. She spent the night on the canyon wall, on the same ledge that had saved her. Flint lay against her feet. The two sheep settled below, finding shelter in a hollow at the wall's base. Mercy did not sleep. She watched the canyon in moonlight, the altered geography, the stripped floor, the absence of everything she had spent 3 months building. The mercury thermometer was somewhere downstream, buried in silt or broken against rocks. Her father's chisels, his brace, his saws scattered across a mile of canyon bottom. The money pouch with their remaining $60 gone, with the cabin wall it had hung on. She owned what she wore, a cotton dress soaked with floodwater, drying stiff with silt, boots that had survived because they were laced tight to her feet, a belt knife Josiah had given her in Missouri, telling her every frontier woman needed a blade she could reach. Without thinking, that was the full inventory. A woman, a dog, 2 sheep, a knife, the clothes she wore, the skills in her hands. Everything else had been donated to the flood. She buried Josiah the next morning on a hillside above the canyon floor, a slope where juniper trees grew from cracks in the caprock, where the soil was thin but present enough to cover a body if you worked at it long enough. She had no shovel. She used flat stones as scoops, her hands as rakes, her boot heels to break through root-bound soil. The grave was shallow, 3 feet, at most, mounded with rocks heavy enough to discourage scavenging animals. She marked it with a slab of sandstone she found nearby, a piece fallen from the canyon rim, flat on one side, rough on the other. She used a single nail she had found in the debris downstream, still straight, still usable, to scratch his name into the flat face. Josiah Whitfield. No dates. She could not remember whether he was born in 1854 or 1853, a confusion that felt like betrayal, even as she recognized its irrelevance. The carving took the rest of the day, not because the letters were complex, but because her body was failing, shoulders bruised from the flood, hands raw from climbing sandstone, muscles depleted from a night without food or sleep. She rested between letters, sitting on the hillside with Flint beside her, looking down at the canyon floor where their homestead had been. The cottonwood trees that had survived the flood still carried their mud lines, only now the lines were fresh, brown, wet, a new record added to the old. She finished the marker as the sun dropped behind the canyon rim, sat beside the grave with the completed slab propped against the mound. Josiah lay beneath rocks on a hillside in Colorado Territory, 28 years old, 3 months into the great Western adventure he had proposed in a Providence parlor that now felt like a memory from someone else's life. Mercy touched the carved letters with her fingertip, the way she had touched the old mud line on the cottonwood on their first day. Both were records of events that had already happened. Both contained information she had received too late to use. The question of staying or leaving resolved itself through arithmetic rather than emotion. Leaving required money she did not have. The nearest town of any size was Elkhorn, 40 miles northeast, a 3-day walk through terrain she did not know. Even if she reached it, she would arrive destitute, no money, no possessions, no connections. She could find domestic work, perhaps, cooking or cleaning for a family, willing to hire a woman with no references, no history in the territory, nothing to recommend her except desperation. The trajectory was clear, downward, indefinite, a life measured in other people's kitchens. Staying required continuous occupation of the claim, per the land office requirements. If she abandoned the property for more than 6 months, she lost the filing, lost the one asset that had any potential value. The claim itself was worthless in its current state, flood-scored dirt with no improvements, but maintaining it preserved the possibility of future value. Staying also required food, shelter, tools, none of which she currently possessed. She stayed, not because staying was wise, but because leaving was worse. Some decisions are not choices between good options, but calculations of which bad option destroys less. Mercy understood this with the clarity of someone who had watched her mother decline into death after her father's, not because her mother wanted to die, but because living had become the harder arithmetic. She built a crude shelter from salvaged lumber pieces of their cabin that the flood had deposited in debris piles downstream. The structure was barely functional. A lean-to against the canyon wall, open on two sides, roofed with canvas torn from the wagon cover, she found snagged on a boulder half a mile down canyon. She ate fish from the creek, which still held trout. Despite the flood, she ate rabbits, flint caught on the canyon slopes. She walked to Coppervale settlement, 8 miles south along the canyon, to buy flour, salt, coffee on credit extended against her land claim by a trading post she had not yet visited, operated by a man she had not yet met. The first weeks after Josiah's death passed in a blur of survival mechanics, gathering food, maintaining shelter, keeping the 2 surviving sheep alive. Mercy performed these tasks with the mechanical efficiency of shock, her body operating on routines while her mind processed loss at a different speed. She did not grieve in the way stories describe grief: no weeping, no collapse, no dramatic moments of despair. She simply moved through days that contained her brother's absence, the way the canyon contained the absence of their cabin. The space where something had been was now occupied by nothing, which turned out to have its own weight, its own texture, its own demands. What she did during those weeks, without intending to, without recognizing it as significant, was observe. She had nothing else to do. The shelter required minimal maintenance. The sheep grazed without supervision. Flint managed security. The creek provided water. The days were long 16 hours of summer daylight, with no construction project, no planning sessions with Josiah, no tasks that required sustained attention. She sat on the hillside near her brother's grave. She walked the canyon floor. She climbed to ledges she had discovered during the flood. She simply existed in the landscape, with the passive attention of someone who has stopped trying to impose purpose on their surroundings. The canyon, observed without agenda, began to reveal its operating logic. She watched water during smaller summer storms, brief afternoon showers that sent thin sheets of runoff down the sandstone walls that raised the creek an inch or two before subsiding. She noticed how the runoff traveled, always down, always toward the lowest point, always following channels carved by previous runoff. She saw how debris accumulated in eddies, behind large rocks, how sand deposited on the inside of creek bends, how the canyon floor acted as a drain for everything above it. Water came from the walls, the rim, the side canyons, the mesa beyond all of it, funneling into the narrow channel at the bottom. She studied the canyon walls themselves. The sandstone was not uniform. Layers of different hardness, stacked like pages in a book. Soft layers that eroded into concavities. Hard layers that protruded as shelves, ledges, overhang. Thousands of years of weather had sculpted the walls into a vertical geography as complex as the horizontal one below. Caves existed where soft layers had been scoured out beneath harder caprock. Ledges ran for hundreds of feet where resistant stone had survived while the layer below it crumbled. Overhangs created sheltered spaces, some shallow, barely deep enough to keep rain off a sitting person, others extending 10, 15, 20 feet into the wall. Natural rooms with stone ceilings. The critical observation came not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow accumulation of evidence. Over the course of several storms, watching from various positions on the canyon walls, she recognized what should have been obvious, but required experience to see. The flood that killed Josiah had followed a pattern. The water stayed on the canyon floor. It rose high, the fresh mud lines proved that, but it did not climb the walls. The natural overhangs, ledges, caves she had used to escape remained untouched. Water could not flow uphill. No matter how high the flood rose, it could not reach positions above its maximum height. Every shelter carved into the canyon walls above the flood line was permanently, structurally, geologically safe from the force that had killed her brother. The simplicity of this fact embarrassed her. It was not genius. It was not insight. It was physics. Water flows downhill. Stone does not move. Elevation equals safety. Anyone who sat on a canyon wall, watching floods for 6 weeks, would reach the same conclusion. The knowledge was available to everyone. It required nothing except time, attention, the willingness to watch rather than build. But no one else had sat on a canyon wall, watching floods for 6 weeks. Everyone else had been busy, rebuilding on the canyon floor, repairing flood damage, replacing what the water had taken, preparing for the next season of the same vulnerability. They were too occupied with conventional survival to observe unconventional safety. Mercy began walking the canyon systematically in late July. She covered miles of wall face, climbing where she could, studying overhangs from below where she could not. She found dozens of natural shelters, some barely more than shallow depressions, others genuine caves extending deep into the sandstone. She evaluated each one against a growing list of criteria that developed through examination rather than planning: elevation above floodline, accessibility from the canyon floor, size of the sheltered space, quality of the stone ceiling, drainage characteristics, orientation relative to prevailing weather. In early August, she found the overhang that stopped her walking, 30 feet above the current canyon floor, accessible by a natural ledge that switch-backed up the wall in 3 stages, each one a traverse of 15 to 20 feet, with a grade steep enough to require attention, but not so vertical that an animal with 4 legs could not navigate it. The overhang itself was created by differential erosion, a layer of exceptionally hard sandstone, what geologists would call caprock, extending outward from the cliff face, while softer layers below had been scoured away over millennia. The result was a natural ceiling 40 feet deep, 20 feet wide, with a solid stone floor worn smooth by ancient water that no longer reached this elevation. The space faced southeast, which meant morning sun penetrated deep into the shelter, while afternoon heat reflected off the opposite canyon wall, rather than entering directly. Prevailing storm winds in this part of Colorado Territory came from the west-northwest. The overhang's orientation placed the open face on the lee side, protected from the worst weather. The ceiling was 8 feet high at the front, tapering to 5 feet at the rear wall, where the overhang met the main canyon face. Mercy could stand upright through most of the space. A cow could stand upright in the front 2/3. She spent an hour in the overhang on that first visit, walking the floor, touching the ceiling, examining the stone for cracks or instability. The sandstone was remarkably solid, the caprock layer harder than anything she had encountered in the canyon, dense enough that her knife blade barely scratched it. She looked at the high water marks on the canyon wall below, the highest marks she had found anywhere in Boxelder Canyon, marks from the most catastrophic floods in the canyon's recorded history, deposited by events that predated human settlement, reached 25 feet above the floor. This overhang sat at 35 feet of margin between the worst flood in history, the floor where she stood. She sat down on the smooth stone. Flint had followed her up the ledge path, without hesitation, the dog's comfort on elevated terrain, confirming what Mercy's measurements suggested. The path was navigable, not just for humans. She looked out at the canyon below, the creek running in its new, post-flood channel, the distant smudge of Coppervale Settlement's wood smoke 8 miles south. She could see upstream for nearly a mile. From this elevation could see any approaching flood with minutes of warning rather than the seconds that had been the difference between her survival, Josiah's death. Her brother had died because they built where building was easy. They should have built where survival was possible. The words formed in her mind with the precision of a joint cut, correctly tight, clean, impossible to argue with. She did not need to test the logic. She did not need to debate alternatives. The conclusion was embedded in the evidence, the way a tenon was embedded in a mortise, held by the shape of the facts around it. She would build here, not a cabin on the canyon floor, where flat ground invited construction, where water access was convenient, where conventional wisdom said to build, because conventional wisdom was written by people who had never watched a flood strip, a valley to bedrock. She would build a hillside shelter, into the canyon wall, above the water, inside the stone. She would close the front of this overhang with a wall, hang a door, create ventilation, collect rainwater, house livestock. She would use the stone. The canyon provided 3 walls, a ceiling, a floor, to eliminate the construction the canyon would destroy. She would build the only structure in Boxelder Canyon that the next flood could not touch. The walk to Coppervale Settlement took 3 hours through canyon terrain that punished every step with loose rock, river crossings, the accumulated fatigue of a body that had spent weeks surviving rather than resting. Mercy led the mule she had borrowed from herself. The animal had wandered back to the canyon 3 days after the flood, found grazing on a bench above the valley floor where it had apparently climbed during the water's rise. The mule's survival reinforced what Mercy already knew. The animal had gone up. Instinct had driven it toward elevation when the water came. Every creature in the canyon, except the humans, had understood the fundamental principle. Higher ground means life. Coppervale Settlement occupied a wide junction, where 3 tributary canyons converged into the main drainage. The geography created a broader valley, perhaps half a mile across, with enough flat ground to support scattered farms. Roughly 30 families lived here. Some clustered near the trading post, others spread along the tributary bottoms, where individual creeks provided water for irrigation. The settlement had a trading post, a sawmill powered by creek water, a community gathering space that served as church on Sundays, meeting hall on weekdays, courthouse, when disputes required public resolution. The structures were conventional frontier architecture: log cabins, frame barns, split-rail fences built on the valley floor near water, near flat ground, near convenience. Built exactly where Mercy had built. Built exactly where floods destroyed. She arrived in late August, thin from weeks of inadequate food, wearing the same dress she had worn through the flood. Washed, mended, permanently stained, with canyon silt at the hemline. Flint walked at her heels. The mule carried empty panniers she intended to fill with supplies she could not afford. People recognized her before she reached the trading post. News traveled through frontier communities with the efficiency of water, through canyons following natural channels, pooling where people gathered, reaching every corner eventually. Everyone in Coppervale knew about the flood that killed her brother. Several families had lost livestock in the same storm system. Sympathy met her at every doorway she passed. Women offering condolences, men removing hats, children staring at the thin woman with the mud-stained dress who had buried her brother alone on a hillside. Sympathy, she was learning, occupied space without providing structure. It filled conversations without building anything. People were sorry. Their sorrow changed nothing about her situation. No tools, no lumber, no money, no help. The trading post occupied the largest building in Coppervale, a log structure with a covered porch where men gathered to discuss weather, politics, livestock prices. Inside, shelves lined 3 walls with the inventory of frontier survival flour, salt, sugar, coffee, tobacco, bolts of cloth, kerosene, ammunition, nails by the pound, rope by the yard, tools hung from pegs. The smell was particular to such places: burlap, iron, dried meat, leather, coal oil, the accumulated transactions of a community that purchased everything it could not grow or build. Harlan Bascom stood behind the counter with the proprietary stillness of a man who owned the room. He was 46 years old, built thick through the shoulders from decades of physical work, his face weathered into a topography of competence. 13 years in Colorado Territory had given him 80 acres under cultivation, 30 head of cattle, 2 hired men, the trading post itself, a reputation as the settlement's most successful farmer. His success was genuine. His opinions carried the weight of demonstrated results. When Bascom said something about farming, planting schedules, livestock management, building methods, people listened because his farm produced more than anyone else's operation. He also carried a wound he rarely discussed. 5 years earlier, a settler named Alcott had arrived in the canyon with ambitious plans for unconventional farming: elevated livestock pens, terraced gardens carved into hillsides, irrigation channels that defied the usual gravity-fed logic. Bascom had extended $40 in credit, partly from business calculation, partly from genuine interest in the man's energy. Alcott built his hillside livestock pen on a slope too steep for the purpose. The first hard winter, 3 cows lost footing on ice approaches. 2 broke legs. 1 fell 30 feet into the canyon bottom. Alcott's operation collapsed. He abandoned the claim, the debt, the territory, leaving Bascom with a $40 lesson about the cost of unconventional thinking. 2 other families had followed similar trajectories, arriving with ideas that diverged from established practice, burning through resources, failing, leaving. Bascom had helped each one with credit or advice, watching each one ignore the advice while spending the credit. The pattern had calcified into a principle he applied with increasing rigidity. Frontier success required conventional methods, proven techniques, the accumulated wisdom of people who had survived long enough to demonstrate that their approach worked. Innovation was a luxury for established operations, not a survival strategy for newcomers. This history occupied Bascom's mind when Mercy Whitfield walked into his trading post with a supply list written on a scrap of canvas in charcoal. She handed him the list. He read it with the practiced eye of a merchant who could estimate a project's scope from its materials, lumber quantities, nail counts, hinge sizes. Tool requirements told a story before the customer explained the plot. He noted the rope, the pulleys, the canvas, standard barn materials, but the quantities were wrong for conventional construction. Too little lumber for a full structure, too much hardware for the amount of wood, rope with no obvious structural purpose. He asked what she was building. Mercy described the overhang, the elevation, the natural protection, the plan to close the front opening with a wall, hang a door, create a hillside shelter that would house livestock above the floodline, inside the canyon wall, protected by 30 feet of vertical separation from the water that had killed her brother. Bascom set down his pencil. The gesture was deliberate, the pause of a man who wanted his response to carry weight beyond casual reaction. He studied her face for signs of what he expected to find, the unfocused quality of grief-driven decision-making, the brittle certainty of someone who had mistaken desperation for inspiration. What he saw instead was patience. The woman in front of him was not agitated, not passionate, not making a case. She was describing a construction project with the flat specificity of someone who had measured, calculated, planned. This unsettled him more than emotion would have, because emotion could be talked down while calculation required counter-calculation. He responded with questions rather than objections. At first, how did she intend to get livestock up a canyon wall? She explained, the natural ledge path, widened with an iron bar, the same gradual training she had used to teach the mule. How would she provide water at that elevation? A collection system carved into the stone above the overhang, channeling rainwater into a storage basin cut from the natural rock floor. What about winter, when snow blocked the ledge path? She would keep it clear with a shovel, the same way any farmer cleared any path to any outbuilding. Each answer was specific. Each one addressed his concern directly without wandering into justification or philosophy. Bascom recognized competence in her responses, the same methodical thinking he applied to his own operation. This recognition produced not admiration but alarm, because competence applied to a flawed concept was more dangerous than incompetence applied to a sound one. A foolish person building a conventional barn would produce a bad barn. A capable person building a barn in a cliff would produce a well-constructed catastrophe. His expression shifted from assessment to something Mercy would later recognize as genuine concern wrapped in condescension. I watched a man named Alcott build livestock pens on a hillside 5 years back. Good hands, smart man, full of plans that made sense when he explained them. Lost 3 cows. The first winter slope was too steep. Ice made the footing treacherous. He went broke, left the territory. I'm still carrying his $40 tab. Bascom's voice held no cruelty. You remind me of him, skilled enough to execute a plan that shouldn't be executed. Mercy absorbed this without visible reaction. She understood his reasoning. It was coherent, experience-based, not malicious. He had watched unconventional approaches fail repeatedly. His conclusion was rational given his dataset. The problem was that his dataset did not include anyone who had observed canyon hydrology the way she had, anyone who had measured high water marks, anyone who had watched floods from above rather than cleaning up after them from below. She asked if he would extend credit for supplies. He agreed against her land claim, with visible reluctance, shaking his head as he wrote the order. Lumber, nails, tools, hinges, rope, pulleys, canvas, an iron, a star drill, a sledgehammer. The total came to $70, more than a conventional barn would cost in materials alone. Bascom noted this discrepancy aloud, pointing out that his own barn, 12-animal capacity, built on flat ground in 5 days, with 2 hired men, had cost $50 in lumber. Other men had gathered during the conversation, drawn by the novelty of a young woman ordering construction supplies for a project that sounded like either madness or misunderstanding. One suggested she sell the claim to someone who could use the land properly. Another recommended remarriage as a more practical solution, To her situation, a woman alone could not farm, could not defend property, could not survive a winter without help. The advice was delivered without hostility, the way one might advise a child against touching a hot stove. Protective condescension, concern that assumed incompetence. A third man, watching from the back of the store, said nothing. Silas Drummond leaned against the rear wall, with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He was 35, lean, quiet, a farmer who had survived 7 years on the frontier through observation rather than force. Before coming west, he had worked as a clerk in a mercantile firm in Pittsburgh, keeping ledgers, tracking inventory, recording every transaction with the compulsive accuracy of someone who believed that what you measured, you could manage. He had brought this habit to farming. His notebooks contained daily entries: feed quantities, milk production, animal health observations, weather conditions, labor hours cost. No other farmer in Coppervale kept records with this precision. Most operated on instinct, tradition, the feel of things. Drummond operated on numbers. He watched Mercy complete her purchase without speaking to her. He watched Bascom shake his head. He watched the other men offer their unsolicited counsel. He filed the interaction in the mental ledger he kept alongside the written ones, a developing account that did not yet have enough entries to draw conclusions from, but that he sensed would eventually balance in an unexpected direction. Only one person approached Mercy before she left. Parthenia Cobb intercepted her near the door, a small woman with sun-darkened skin, calloused hands, gray threading through brown hair, pulled back with practical severity. Parthenia was 42, widowed 3 years, her husband taken by pneumonia during a winter that had also killed 2 of their horses. She ran her farm with her teenage son, refusing every suggestion that she sell, move to town, remarry for security. She understood what it cost a woman to operate independently on the frontier, not just the physical labor, but the social tax, the constant friction of existing outside the role the community had designated for you. She asked Mercy one question: "Have you measured the high water marks from previous floods?" Mercy met her eyes. "Every one I can find. The highest is 25 feet. I'm building at 30. Parthenia nodded with the compressed satisfaction of someone hearing a correct answer to a test she had not announced. Ignore every word those men just spoke. Then she turned back to her own shopping, the conversation complete. The construction that followed consumed 4 months of labor that would have broken most people through sheer monotony. The physical difficulty was manageable, hard but finite. Each task with a clear beginning, middle, completion. The psychological difficulty was harder. Working alone, day after day, on a project that no one supported, no one assisted, no one believed in, required a relationship with solitude that most humans could not sustain. Mercy sustained it, the way her father had sustained decades of basement workshop, hours through absorption in the work itself, the particular concentration that occurs when hands engage with material, when problems become tangible rather than abstract, when progress is measured in inches rather than opinions. She widened the ledge path first. The natural switchback route up the canyon wall contained several sections too narrow for the mule to pass. Rock protrusions that pinched the path to shoulder width, loose sections where the stone had fractured into unstable footing. She attacked these obstructions with the iron bar, hammering stone away in chips that fell to the canyon floor. 30 feet below, she tied herself to a rope anchored to a juniper tree growing from a crack in the canyon wall above the work area. The rope would catch her if she fell. She tested the tree's hold repeatedly before trusting it, pulling with her full weight, bracing her feet against the wall, loading the anchor with as much force as she could generate. The juniper held. Its roots had found their way deep into the stone's fracture network, gripping the canyon with the tenacity of something that had survived decades of wind, ice, gravity. After 2 days, the ledge was passable. The mule navigated it with nervous reluctance on the first trip, calm acceptance by the third. Mercy rewarded the animal with grain at the top each time, building the association between the climb, the reward, until the path became routine rather than obstacle. Clearing the overhang revealed the space's full potential. Beneath centuries of accumulated debris, sand, rockfall, dead vegetation, bones of animals that had sheltered here before her, the stone floor was remarkably smooth. Ancient water had polished it during an era when floods still reached this elevation, before the canyon had cut deeper into the bedrock, lowering the water's maximum height. The floor was a gift from geological time, a surface that would have required days of labor to create, but that nature had prepared over millennia. She examined the ceiling with a craftsman's eye for structural integrity. The caprock layer was dense, fine-grained, harder than any sandstone she had encountered in the canyon. No cracks ran through it, no sections appeared, ready to separate from the main mass. The overhang had existed for thousands of years, because this stone was harder than everything around it. A principle she understood instinctively from her father's workshop. The strongest material in a structure defined the structure's lifespan. Everything weaker would fail first. She waited for rain before beginning construction. When a storm arrived in mid-September, she sat in the overhang, watching how water moved across the stone. Runoff from the canyon wall above cascaded over the caprock edge, creating a curtain of falling water across the front opening, dramatic to watch, harmless to the interior space. Some water seeped along the back wall, where the overhang met the vertical canyon face, following cracks too fine to see, but present enough to channel moisture. This seepage would need to be managed. Standing water against the back wall would create dampness, mold, unhealthy conditions for livestock. She carved drainage channels using the iron bar, cutting shallow grooves into the stone floor that directed any seepage toward the canyon edge. 3 days of work. Each groove was tested with buckets of creek. Water hauled up the ledge path, poured against the back wall, watched as it found the channels, followed them to the edge, dropped away. The system worked with the elegant inevitability of gravity, applied to geometry. Water had no choice but to follow the lowest path, which was now the path Mercy had carved. The front wall construction began in October with the anchor holes. Star drills were specialized tools designed for a specific misery. You held the drill against stone, struck its head with a hammer, rotated it a quarter turn, struck again, rotated, struck, rotated, through hundreds of repetitions that pulverized stone into dust, 1 fractional inch at a time. Each of her 12 anchor holes required an hour of this percussive monotony, an hour of vibration, traveling through the drill into her hands, her wrists, her forearms, her shoulders, her spine. The first star drill mushroomed after 7 holes, the striking surface spreading, deforming, becoming too wide for accurate hammer contact. She stared at the ruined tool in the failing October light, her hands trembling from hours of percussion, blisters weeping through the calluses she had built over months. 5 holes remained. The nearest replacement was an 8-mile walk to Coppervale, 16 miles round trip, a full day lost. More of Bascom's commentary about money wasted on impractical ambition. For the first time since Josiah's death, she felt the weight of the project not as challenge but as possible mistake. 5 holes. 5 hours of drilling she could not perform, with a tool that no longer functioned. She sat on the stone floor of the overhang, with the mushroomed drill in her lap, Flint beside her, the canyon darkening below, asking herself the question she had successfully avoided for 2 months. What if they're right? What if this is grief dressed up as engineering? She walked to Coppervale the next morning. She bought the replacement drill. She endured Bascom's observation that she had now spent more on tools alone than most people spent on an entire outbuilding. She walked back. She drilled the remaining 5 holes. The question did not disappear, but she learned something about doubt. That afternoon it did not require an answer, only a decision. She could doubt the project while continuing to build it. The 2 activities were not mutually exclusive. Doubt without action was paralysis. Action without doubt was recklessness. She chose to hold both. The way her hands held the drill, the way the stone held her anchor pins, not comfortably, but functionally. 12 holes, 8 inches deep, spaced along the 20-foot width of the opening. Into each hole, she positioned the base of an anchor post, 8-inch square beams, cut to the precise height between floor-ceiling. Through each post's base, she had augured a vertical hole, using her father's brace with its largest bit. Iron pin, half an inch thick, 10 inches long, passed through the post holes into the stone anchor holes below. She drove them flush with the sledgehammer, each blow seating the pin deeper, locking wood to stone, with a connection that could not be pulled apart without destroying one material or the other. Horizontal planking between the posts. required a different kind of precision. She had chosen horizontal over vertical orientation because each plank could tie in to multiple posts, distributing load across the full width of the wall rather than concentrating it at single points. Every board was cut to exact length, its ends notched to wrap around the posts, attached with iron nails, driven at opposing angles, a technique her father had used for drawer bottoms, where nails driven straight pulled out under load, but nails driven at crossed angles, locked into the wood fibers from two directions, resisting withdrawal. Every fourth plank extended beyond the posts on both sides, reaching into mortises she had chiseled into the canyon's stone walls. These extended planks served as ties, connecting her wooden wall directly to the geology on either side. The result was not a freestanding wall, but an integrated system, wood locking into stone, locking into wood, each element bracing the others, the whole structure borrowing the canyon's permanence for its own stability. The chinking compound required experimentation that consumed a week of trial, failure, adjustment. Pure clay from the creek bank cracked when it dried, shrinking away from the wood it was supposed to seal. Pine pitch rendered from boiled sap remained too pliable, softening in afternoon heat, dripping from vertical applications. She tried mixing them. The combination was better, more flexible than clay alone, more rigid than pitch alone, but still cracked along the bond line where compound met wood. The solution came from the mule. Mercy was grooming the animal one evening when a clump of tail hair came away in her hand. She studied the fibers, long, strong, flexible, resistant to moisture. Her father had once explained how horsehair was mixed into plaster to prevent cracking, the fibers bridging microfractures before they could propagate into macro failures. She combined creek clay, coarse sand for structural body, mule tail hair for crack resistance, rendered pine pitch for waterproofing. The mixture required warming over her fire to keep the pitch workable. Applied hot, packed into gaps with a wooden spatula. She carved for the purpose. The compound cooled into a seal that flexed with temperature changes without separating from the wood. The door was her finest work, the piece that would have made her father pause mid-sentence. 3 layers of planking, laminated, together with hide glue. She rendered from scrap leather, soaked, boiled, reduced to viscous adhesive, applied hot between the layers. The assembly clamped with rope tourniquets, twisted tight with sticks, until the glue cured overnight. The finished door was 3 inches thick, rigid enough that pressing against its center produced no flex whatsoever. She hung it on 5-pound iron hinges seated in mortises chiseled into the canyon wall, bolted through the stone with iron pins driven from the interior side. The door opened outward, a deliberate choice. Livestock pressing against the door from inside would push it closed. Wind pressing from outside would push it closed. Only intentional human force pulling the door open could open it. She finished the hillside shelter in late November. Ventilation ports, shutter mechanisms, the water collection channel, carved 15 feet above the entrance. The wooden trough feeding rainwater into a 30-gallon stone basin. Each detail addressed a specific problem she had identified through observation rather than assumption. She had not built from plans drawn in the comfort of a workshop. She had built from problems encountered in the reality of the space, each solution custom, fitted to the specific conditions of this overhang, this canyon, this climate. The completed wall, viewed from the canyon floor, was nearly invisible. Weathered wood matching the tans, browns, reds of surrounding sandstone. Unless someone knew exactly where to look, no one, except Mercy, her mule, her dog, knew where to look. The hillside shelter disappeared into the geology. She had not planned this camouflage. She recognized its value only after completion, studying her work from below with the disorienting experience of being unable to locate something she had spent months building. Isolation meant vulnerability. A structure that could not be seen, could not be targeted. The canyon was providing security she had not known to request. Bascom climbed the ledge path on a cold morning in November, uninvited, breathing hard, his knees protesting the elevation gain. He entered the hillside shelter without asking permission, running his merchant's hands along surfaces, with the evaluative touch of someone who understood material quality even when he disagreed with its application. He tested the door, examined the hinges in their stone mortises, studied the lock beam mechanism, looked up at ventilation ports, walked to the water basin, inspected feed bins built against the rear wall. The inspection lasted 20 minutes. Mercy watched without speaking. She could see the conflict working through his expression, the craftsman in him, recognizing quality, the pragmatist in him, rejecting the premise. His assessment arrived in two parts. The first was grudging respect, delivered through clenched teeth. The wall was sound. The door was exceptional. The integration of wood into stone showed genuine understanding of structural principles. The second was firm dismissal. This hillside shelter held perhaps 6 animals comfortably. His valley barn held 12. She had spent 4 months building what he had completed in 5 days. Even granting that her elevated position eliminated flood risk, the practical limitations made the concept inefficient for any operation beyond bare subsistence. He walked to the entrance, pointed down at his own farm, visible 2 miles south. 80 acres, 30 head, 2 hired men, a thriving enterprise. How many animals can you keep in this cave? 6 sheep, 2 milk cows. Her voice carried no defensiveness, no apology. That's not farming. That's hiding. He descended the ledge without waiting for her response, calling observations down to the group of men waiting below. Phrases floated up through canyon acoustics. Well-built but pointless. Interesting carpentry. Questionable judgment. Laughter followed. The canyon walls amplified it into something that sounded like the landscape itself was amused. Over the following weeks, Bascom's assessment calcified into community consensus. He told the 2 recently arrived families, the Paytons, the Stanfords, that Mercy's methods represented grief-driven impracticality, not innovation worth studying. He framed his warning as protection. Newcomers needed guidance from experienced settlers, not distraction from a woman whose brother's death had compromised her judgment. The framing was effective because it was partially sincere. Bascom genuinely believed he was preventing another Alcott, another waste of resources, another failure that would cost him uncollectible credit. But sincerity does not preclude damage. His influence closed doors that might have opened. The Paytons, who had initially expressed interest in understanding all available building approaches, stopped asking Mercy questions after Bascom's conversation with them. The community's social architecture, who spoke to whom, who sat together at Sunday gatherings, who offered help during barn raisings, shifted to exclude Mercy from the cooperative networks that made frontier survival possible. She was not shunned. She was simply moved to the periphery, the position reserved for people whose judgment was considered unreliable. Silas Drummond observed this social reorganization without participating in it. Twice during that autumn, Mercy noticed him sitting on the canyon rim above her overhang, watching her work with the patient stillness of someone cataloging data. He never called down greetings. He never offered opinions. He sat for an hour, then left. His attention carried a quality she could not name, but could feel, not mockery, not sympathy, not curiosity exactly. Assessment, the patience of someone waiting for evidence before forming a conclusion. She moved her animals into the hillside shelter in late November, 1882. 4 additional sheep purchased from a family departing the territory brought her flock to 6 when combined with the 2 that had survived the first flood. 2 milk cows she had acquired through a complicated trade involving her mule, $30 of remaining credit, a promise of labor she would owe the following spring. Training the cows to climb the ledge path had required 3 weeks of repetitive conditioning, leading each animal up the switchbacks with grain rewards, repeating the journey until the path became associated with food rather than fear. The sheep adapted immediately, their mountain goat ancestry, making elevated terrain instinctive rather than learned. Winter arrived in January, 1883, with a ferocity that challenged even veteran settlers. Temperatures dropped below 0 at night, barely reaching 20 degrees by mid-afternoon. Snow accumulated on the canyon floor in layers that compacted into ice where foot traffic compressed it. Wind channeled through the canyon's throat, with velocities that stripped heat from any structure not protected by geology. Inside the hillside shelter, the mercury thermometer, a replacement she had purchased in Coppervale, cheaper than her father's lost instrument, but functional, never read below 40 degrees. Mercy recorded the temperature twice daily in a notebook she had begun keeping, conscious that claims without evidence were just stories. The stone walls absorbed heat during the day, from weak winter sun striking the southeast-facing opening, from animal body heat radiating continuously, from the small juniper-burning stove she had installed with its pipe venting through the front wall. The absorbed heat penetrated deep into the sandstone mass surrounding the shelter on 3 sides. 4 if you counted the ceiling. At night, when exterior temperatures plummeted, the stone reversed its thermal flow, releases stored warmth gradually, maintaining the interior at a temperature that required no additional fuel beyond what the stove consumed during daytime hours. Her sheep grew winter wool, so thick she could press her fingers into the second knuckle before touching skin. Her cows ate 19 pounds of hay per day. She weighed the portions on a scale borrowed from Parthenia cob, producing 2.5 gallons of milk each, rich enough that the cream separated into a layer Mercy could skim for butter. Neither animal showed signs of stress. No respiratory symptoms, no weight loss, no decreased production, no restless behavior indicating discomfort. The animals were, by every measurable standard, thriving. Reports from the valley told a different story. Bascom lost 2 calves to cold stress in February, despite housing them in his large conventional barn. Other settlers described ice in water troughs, requiring multiple daily breaks, frozen barn floors that created unsanitary conditions impossible to clean, feed consumption spikes as animals burned calories for body warmth rather than growth or production. One farmer reported a respiratory outbreak among his cattle that required treatment with turpentine poultices, a remedy that sometimes worked, sometimes accelerated the decline it was supposed to prevent. Mercy shared her numbers carefully when asked, providing exact figures without editorial commentary. Interior temperature never below 40. Hay consumption, 19 pounds per cow per day. Milk production, 2.5 gallons per cow per day. Animal health, no illness. The numbers landed differently depending on who received them. Bascom dismissed them as irrelevant to serious farming. 8 animals were a sample too small to prove anything, he argued, conveniently ignoring that his own 30-head operation provided him with 30 data points that could equally be questioned. Others filed the information without acting on it, waiting as frontier people often did for more evidence before revising their assumptions. The spring thaw confirmed what winter had suggested. March brought snow smelt from the high country, combined with early rains, a combination that produced flooding throughout the canyon system. Not catastrophic like the flood that killed Josias, but substantial enough to expose the vulnerability of every structure built at valley level. Bascom's barn flooded on March 18th. Water rose to 18 inches inside, soaking 2 months of stored hay, creating a mud floor that required 3 days of shoveling before the space was usable again. His livestock had to be relocated to higher ground temporarily, disrupting feeding routines, stressing animals already depleted from winter. He calculated the damage at $60 in ruined feed, $20 in repair labor, $80 total, more than the entire construction cost of the hillside shelter he had called pointless. Other valley barns suffered proportionally. 3 families lost significant quantities of stored grain. 2 reported structural damage where floodwater had undermined foundations. The community gathering space near the trading post took 6 inches of water, warping floorboards that would need replacement before summer meetings could resume. Mercy's hillside shelter remained dry. She watched brown water flow through the canyon. 30 feet below the entrance, her animals calm behind her, her feed supplies untouched, her routines uninterrupted. She did not visit the settlement to point this out. The contrast made its own argument without her assistance. Drummond noticed. He rode to the canyon rim during the flooding, sat on his usual observation point above Mercy's overhang, watched how the elevated position rendered the flood irrelevant, not just manageable, not just survivable, but literally irrelevant. Water that destroyed valley structures did not exist at this altitude. The hillside shelter did not resist floods. It transcended them. Parthenia Cobb climbed the ledge on a mid-March afternoon carrying bread, dried venison, a jar of blackberry preserves, her notebook. She arrived with the deliberate energy of someone who had planned this visit for weeks, choosing the timing to coincide with a stretch of winter so her observations would capture the hillside shelter's performance under stress. She spent 2 hours inside, examining every system with the intensity of a woman, who had spent 3 years managing a farm alone, who understood that survival on the frontier was not about following convention, but about identifying what actually worked. She asked questions no man in Coppervale had thought to ask. How did moisture behave inside the space? Did condensation form on the ceiling when animal breath raised humidity? Mercy showed her the ventilation ports. When opened, they created crossflow that carried moisture out faster than it accumulated. When closed during storms, the stone walls absorbed excess humidity, the way they absorbed heat, releasing it gradually, rather than allowing it to condense on cold surfaces. Parthenia wanted construction cost comparisons. Mercy provided exact figures: $70 in materials versus Bascom's $50 for his conventional barn, but his $50 required 2 hired men working 5 days, adding labor cost. Mercy's labor was her own, unpaid, essentially free in monetary terms, though expensive in time. The comparison depended on whether you valued cash expenditure or total effort. For someone with money to hire help, conventional construction was cheaper. For someone with only time, the hillside shelter cost less in the currency she actually possessed. Long-term maintenance calculations shifted the comparison further. Mercy's wooden wall might need new chinking in 5 years, new planks in 15. The stone components, floor, walls, ceiling would last indefinitely, requiring zero maintenance. A conventional barn needed roof replacement every 7 to 10 years, foundation repairs as settling occurred, continuous chinking maintenance as wood weathered. Over 20 years, cumulative maintenance costs for conventional construction would exceed the initial construction cost of the hillside shelter. The front-loaded time, investment paid returns through decades of reduced upkeep. Parthenia wrote everything down. When she finished, she closed her notebook, with the care of someone handling something valuable. Would you help me design one for my property? I have a cliff face on my upper pasture that might work. Mercy felt something shift inside her chest. Not dramatic, not transformative, but structural. Like a joint seating into its mortise. After careful fitting, the click of something reaching its intended position. For months, she had built in isolation against unanimous dismissal. This woman with her notebook, her careful questions, her willingness to evaluate evidence rather than defer to reputation, was the first person to treat Mercy's work as knowledge worth acquiring. Not curiosity, not entertainment, not pity disguised as interest. Genuine recognition that what Mercy had learned through observation, loss, solitary labor contained value that could be transferred, applied, replicated. She agreed immediately. When the floods receded, settlers gathered at the trading post for the accounting that always followed water damage. Bascom reported his losses, others reported theirs. Someone mentioned that the Whitfield woman's barn had stayed dry, positioned above everything. Bascom acknowledged this was factually accurate, but insisted it proved nothing about the method's broader value. The time she had invested in construction exceeded the value of avoiding occasional flood damage, he argued. A farmer standing next to him disagreed. Flood damage was not occasional, but regular spring flooding happened most years. Summer flash floods struck unpredictably. If elevated construction eliminated those costs entirely, the initial time investment became a capital improvement that appreciated annually rather than a sunk cost. The debate cracked the settlement's consensus without shattering it. Those who had invested in conventional construction found reasons to defend their investment. Those who had questioned conventional wisdom found evidence to support their questioning. The community did not split. It developed a fracture line that ran through every gathering, every conversation, every decision about building, planting, investing in the shared future of Coppervale settlement. Drummond arrived at the hillside shelter in April, without announcement, carrying a ledger book, finding Mercy repairing winter damage to the ledge path. He picked up a stone, began helping her rebuild a section, where freeze-thaw cycles had loosened the widened portion. They worked together for 30 minutes, without speaking, the silence of two people who communicated through action rather than conversation. Inside the shelter, he examined her animals with the detailed attention of a man who knew what healthy livestock looked like. He asked to see her records. She showed him the notebook, daily milk production, feed quantities, behavioral observations. He opened his own ledger beside hers, on the workbench, running his finger down columns of figures, comparing entries with the focused absorption of someone performing calculations that mattered. His cows consumed 23 pounds of hay daily through winter. Hers consumed 19. His cows produced 2.25 gallons of milk. Hers produced 2.5. His animals had required multiple treatments for respiratory illness. Hers had required none. The numbers were unambiguous. Her operation was more efficient by every measurable margin, less input, more output, better health. He performed the arithmetic aloud, talking to himself more than to Mercy, working through the implications with the rigor of a man who believed in numbers, the way other men believed in tradition. 4 pounds of hay saved per cow per day, scaled to 10 dairy cows over a 6-month winter. 7,200 pounds. At $2 per 100 pounds, $144 in reduced feed costs annually. Her hillside shelter had cost $70 in materials. Your barn pays for itself before the first winter ends. His voice carried surprise, not at the conclusion, but at its magnitude. He asked about her explanation. She described thermal mass, the stone's capacity to absorb, store, release heat, creating a temperature buffer that eliminated the extremes conventional structures could not prevent. Animals in stable thermal environments burned fewer calories, maintaining body temperature, converting feed into production rather than survival. Reduced stress meant reduced illness. Reduced illness meant reduced treatment costs, reduced mortality, increased productive lifespan. Drummond closed his ledger. I want to build one. I have a rock outcropping on my east boundary that creates an overhang. It's smaller than this, maybe enough for 4 animals. I want to test it against my valley barn, with identical stock, identical feed, measured results. Would you help me design it? She walked his property with him the following week. The outcropping was promising, elevated, accessible, with a natural overhang, deep enough for a modest structure. They spent hours discussing adaptation, how to modify her principles for his specific site's dimensions, orientation geology. He ordered materials before they finished planning. The decision already made, by numbers, that required no faith. The community meeting in May 1883 brought the fracture line into public view. Bascom, sensing that his influence was eroding, incrementally, as Mercy's results accumulated, escalated from private dismissal to public action. He proposed formally, before the assembled settlement, that the community counsel Mercy Whitfield to sell her claim. His framing was careful. A woman alone in a canyon wall was unsafe. The living conditions were unsuitable. The community had a responsibility to prevent a vulnerable member from endangering herself through unconventional choices. The room divided before he finished speaking. Parthenia Cobb stood before the last sentence cleared Bascom's lips. Are you concerned about her safety, Harlan? Or are you concerned that she's right? The question landed like a hammer on a star drill, precise, percussive, impossible to deflect without revealing the stone beneath the surface. Bascom's face darkened. He was not accustomed to public challenge, particularly from a woman, particularly on a matter where his expertise was supposed to be definitive. He responded with scale, the argument he returned to, whenever specifics failed him. His operation produced more. His methods fed more livestock. Her hillside shelter was a novelty that might work for 8 animals, but proved nothing about feeding a territory. Drummond spoke for the first time at a community meeting, his voice carrying the flat authority of numbers rather than opinion. He read from his ledger feed comparisons, production data, health records. He did not argue for Mercy's method. He presented the data, let the figures speak in their own language, a language that could not be dismissed with anecdote or authority. Mercy stood last. She did not rebut Bascom. She read her notebook entries. 5 months of temperature records, feed quantities, milk production, animal health observations. No rhetoric, no appeals. Just measurements taken by a woman who understood that what you could demonstrate mattered more than what you could argue. The room sat silent for several seconds after she finished. Nobody could challenge the numbers without challenging the concept of counting itself. Bascom retreated to his final position. 8 animals don't prove anything about real farming. Come back when you're feeding 30 head from a hole in a rock. The meeting dispersed without resolution, but the settlement's social landscape had shifted beneath the surface. 2 new families, the ones Bascom had warned, away from Mercy, sought her out afterward, asking quiet questions about elevated construction, thermal mass, flood margins. They had not yet committed to conventional building. They were still choosing. June brought the completion of Drummond's stone-integrated barn, built into his rock outcropping, following principles Mercy had developed, adapted to his specific terrain. He stocked it with 4 cows selected from his main herd animals, matched in age, breed, condition to 4 counterparts, remaining in his valley barn. The experiment was controlled in ways that frontier agriculture rarely attempted. Same feed, same management, different shelter. He would measure everything, compare everything, publish his findings to anyone who asked. July 1883 brought weather that turned the fracture into a fault line. Rain fell steadily for 3 days, stopped for 2, resumed for 3 more. The pattern cycled through the entire month without breaking. Canyon streams ran high continuously. Soil that had dried through June became saturated, then supersaturated, unable to absorb another drop, converting every subsequent rainfall into immediate surface runoff. Side canyons, that normally carried trickles, began running with persistent streams. Debris flows deposited mud at tributary junctions, partially damming the main drainage, creating conditions where any additional water would have nowhere to go except through the canyon system at whatever velocity the accumulated volume demanded. Old-timers spoke about 1870. 13 years earlier, a similar pattern had preceded a catastrophic flood that destroyed everything in the canyon bottoms. Farms, cabins, livestock. All of it swept away in a single night. Several lives lost. The survivors rebuilt in the same locations, gambling that such events were rare enough to absorb as periodic cost. 13 years without repetition had validated the gamble. The 1870 flood receded into memory, into the category of historical anomaly that justified present risk. Mercy measured what she could. High water marks on canyon walls, some old, some refreshed by the current wet season, showed floods reaching 25, 30, even 40 feet above the normal creek level. Debris caught in tree branches at elevations that seemed impossible until you accepted the evidence of the debris itself. The canyon had a memory written in mud, in silt, in the bones of trees, stripped bare by water, that had climbed higher than anyone currently alive had witnessed. At the community gathering in late July, she stood, with the reluctance of someone who understood that speaking would cost more than silence, but that silence might cost more than speaking. The weather pattern matched 1870, she told them. The ground could not absorb further rainfall. Any significant storm would generate immediate, massive runoff through a canyon system already running at capacity. She recommended moving valuables to elevated positions, preparing evacuation routes to high ground, identifying which structures could be reached from which locations in minutes rather than hours. Simple preparations that cost nothing except effort. Bascom responded before her words had settled. Fear-mongering served no one. Wet summers occurred periodically without catastrophe. 1878 had been equally wet, producing no major flood. Disrupting farm operations based on weather speculation was the kind of impractical thinking that characterized people who built barns and caves instead of on solid ground. His counter carried weight because it contained truth. The 1878 precedent was real. Not every wet summer produced a catastrophic flood. Mercy could not guarantee that this pattern would end in disaster. She was predicting, not prophesying, offering probability rather than certainty. The distinction gave people permission to choose the more comfortable interpretation. Most chose comfort. They had crops to manage, livestock to tend, routines that did not accommodate precautionary disruption based on one woman's reading of mud stains on canyon walls. The meeting ended with most settlers planning to continue normal operations. Parthenia moved her most valuable possessions to her upper pasture that evening. Drummond relocated his breeding stock to his stone-integrated barn on the elevated outcropping. The 2 new families, still uncommitted to building sites, quietly chose elevated positions for their planned construction, not yet announcing the decision, simply filing homestead plans that placed their future structures above the marks Mercy had measured. The storm arrived on August 9th with the patience of something that had been organizing itself for weeks. Afternoon thunderheads that normally built, struck, moved on, instead, anchored themselves above the high plateau country, feeding the Boxelder watershed. the clouds stacked vertically into anvil formations that blocked the western sun by 2 o'clock, turning the canyon into premature twilight. Rain began falling on slick rock mesas 10 miles upstream, not the scattered showers of a passing system, but a concentrated downpour that struck stone surfaces, incapable of absorbing a single drop. Every ounce of water sheeted off, exposed rock into drainage channels, into tributary gullies, into feeder canyons that all pointed the same direction, toward Boxelder Canyon's main channel, toward the valley floor, where 30 families had built their lives beside a creek that was about to remember what it was capable of becoming. Mercy stood at the entrance of the hillside shelter, watching the creek transform. The first hour brought a gradual rise water, climbing the banks, spreading across the low ground nearest the channel, creeping toward the bases of cottonwood trees that still bore the mud lines from 14 months earlier. Normal behavior for a heavy storm. Nothing that would alarm settlers accustomed to seasonal fluctuation. The second hour brought speed. The creek stopped, rising gradually. It surged, jumping 6 inches in minutes, carrying debris that had not been in the water, moments before branches, brush, clumps of grass torn from upstream banks. The color shifted from the usual tea-brown of sandstone-filtered water to a darker shade, opaque with suspended sediment, drawn from slopes that were shedding their topsoil under the rain's sustained assault. The third hour brought sound. The creek's voice changed register from the conversational murmur of flowing water to something deeper, more percussive, a vibration she felt through the stone floor of the hillside shelter before her ears fully processed it. Boulders, rocks too heavy for normal current, were being rolled along the canyon bottom by a volume of water that had crossed the threshold between stream behavior into something without a name in her vocabulary. The grinding was continuous, underlaid with impact stone, striking stone, the canyon's bedrock absorbing collisions from projectiles. It had launched downstream centuries ago, during floods exactly like this one. The fourth hour brought the wall. She saw it from above, the advantage of elevation that had defined every choice she had made since Josiah died. A mile upstream, where the canyon narrowed before widening into the valley, the entire visible surface of the drainage shifted. Not a wave, not a surge, but a displacement, the canyon floor's worth of air, replaced by a moving mass of brown-black water that was not flowing but advancing, pushing a front of debris, foam, shattered timber ahead of it, like the bow wave of a ship built from destruction. The wall was 10 feet higher than the already swollen creek, traveling with a velocity that closed the mile of visible canyon in minutes. Mercy grabbed the rifle she kept inside the door. She ran down the ledge path to the canyon rim, Flint at her heels. From the highest point she could reach in 30 seconds, a cap rock outcropping above the ledge entrance, she fired 3 times into the heavy air. The reports cracked through canyon acoustics, bouncing between sandstone walls, multiplying into a cascade of echoes that carried further than any human voice could travel. Through storm noise, 3 shots. The emergency signal every frontier settlement understood because the wilderness demanded a language louder than speech. 3 rapid shots meant danger beyond individual crisis. Flood, fire, hostile approach. The signal required no interpretation, no debate, no committee decision. It required action. A quarter-mile south, a homesteader named Garrett heard the shots through the rain. He reached for his own rifle, fired 3 times from his doorstep, relaying the signal downstream. His neighbor heard it, repeated it. The chain propagated through the valley at the speed of sound, far faster than water, far faster than a woman running, fast enough to reach Coppervale, settlement's outer farms, before the flood wall reached the valley's upper end. Parthenia Cobb heard the third relay. She did not hesitate, did not look upstream, did not calculate. She rang her farm bell, the heavy iron bell mounted on a post beside her door. The bell used for Sunday gathering calls, harvest announcements, the rare emergencies that required every person within earshot to stop what they were doing. Listen. The bell's voice was different from gunshots. Sustained, urgent, impossible to mistake for anything natural. It filled the valley the way the flood would fill the canyon, reaching into every structure, every field, every corner where someone might be working with their head down, focused on tasks that were about to become irrelevant. People looked up. People looked west. People saw the sky, heard the grinding undertone beneath the thunder, understood with a visceral comprehension that bypasses rational assessment. They ran. The geography of survival narrowed to a single question. Where was high ground accessible within the minutes remaining before the wall arrived? Mercy's hillside shelter sat above the upper valley, reachable from the canyon rim trail that ran along the top of the southern wall. The trail was above the flood zone, not a valley path but a ridge route, carved by deer, maintained by occasional human use, passable at a run for people, motivated by the sound growing behind them. Drummond reached the ledge path first, driving his family ahead of him, his wife carrying their youngest, his two older children scrambling up the switchbacks. With the agility that children possess when fear overrides caution, he turned to help his 4 relocated cows, slapping their hindquarters to drive them upward. The animals had learned the route to their own stone-integrated barn on his property. This path was unfamiliar, but the upward direction triggered the same instinct that had saved Mercy's mule 14 months earlier. The cows climbed. Parthenia arrived next with her son, both of them driving sheep ahead of them with sticks, shouting, pushing the flock up the narrow ledge. The sheep moved with panicked speed, their hooves finding purchase on stone surfaces that had been improved by Mercy's iron bar work the previous autumn. Behind the sheep came the Peyton family. The newcomers Bascom had warned away from Mercy's influence. They carried nothing except their youngest child, held against the father's chest. More followed. The Stanford family, the Garretts, 3 families from the settlement's outer edge, who had heard the bell, seen the water, calculated that the canyon rim trail offered better odds than their valley positions. They climbed the ledge with the desperate efficiency of people who had no time for uncertainty. An elderly couple, the Marshalls, who farmed the lowest ground in the valley, arrived supported by their adult grandson, both of them breathing in ragged gasps from a run that had covered half a mile in minutes. Bascom arrived last. He came up the ledge path alone, without livestock, without possessions, without the commanding posture that had defined his presence in every room, every meeting, every conversation for 13 years. His face showed something Mercy had never seen on him, the expression of a man confronting the full weight of consequences he had explicitly chosen not to prepare for. He had dismissed the warning. He had counseled others to dismiss it. He had used his influence, his reputation, his success as evidence that conventional thinking protected against unconventional threats. The flood wall, now grinding through the upper canyon, was his rebuttal, delivered in a language that did not accommodate appeals to experience or authority. He pulled himself over the final ledge section on his hands, his knees failing. On the steep grade, his breathing audible above the growing roar. He did not look at Mercy as he passed through the doorway she had built. He went directly to the rear wall, pressed his back against stone, slid to the floor, sat with his forearms on his raised knees, his head bowed. 17 people. Mercy counted them as they pressed into the space: adults, children, the elderly Marshalls, Drummond's family, Parthenia with her son. Livestock filled the remaining floor area. Drummond's 4 cows, Mercy's own animals, Parthenia's sheep, 2 horses that had followed their owners up the ledge, without guidance. The space designed for 8 animals now held 23 humans, approximately 15 large animals, an unknown number of sheep pressed against every available wall surface. The flood hit the canyon below them with a sound that redefined Mercy's understanding of volume. Every previous noise in her life, thunder, gunshots, the first flood that killed Josiah, became retroactively quiet by comparison. This was not a sound but a physical force, a vibration that entered the body through the floor, the walls, the air itself, rattling teeth, compressing lungs, turning the stone shelter into a resonating chamber for the canyon's destruction. Water rose to within 12 feet of the entrance. She could see it through the opening brown-black surface, boiling with turbulence, carrying objects that took several seconds to identify, because the mind resisted interpreting them correctly. Whole structures passing intact, a wall section, with a window still glazed, spinning slowly in the current, complete trees, root balls, trailing downstream like anchors being dragged, the carcass of a horse, bloated, rolling, the peaked roof of what might have been a chicken coop, floating level for a moment, before striking a submerged boulder, breaking apart into planks that were immediately absorbed into the general debris. Bascom's barn passed below them at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening. Mercy recognized it by the proportions, the wide door opening he had pointed to from this same vantage point. 9 months earlier, when he had stood at this entrance, looking down at his empire as evidence of his judgment, the structure was largely intact, carried by the current, as though the flood had simply picked it up from its foundation, set it on the water's surface, sent it downstream like a boat launched without ceremony. It struck the canyon wall 200 yards below the shelter, broke across its long axis, folded inward, disappeared beneath the surface in pieces. 12 years, 80 acres, 30 head of cattle, 2 hired men, a trading post, a reputation. All of it reduced to lumber fragments tumbling through black water in a canyon that had never promised permanence to anyone who cared to read its walls. Inside the shelter, Mercy moved through the compressed crowd with methodical calm. She distributed water from the stone basin using a tin cup, handing it to each person in sequence, refilling from the basin, repeating. She shared dried meat from her emergency source. Not enough for a meal, enough to occupy hands' mouths, the restless anxiety of people who needed to do something while they waited for the flood to decide whether 12 feet of margin was sufficient. The children clustered near the center of the space, surrounded by adults on all sides, insulated from the entrance, where the flood's visual evidence was most overwhelming. Mercy knelt beside the youngest, the Peyton's daughter, perhaps 4 years old, tucked against her mother's chest with her face hidden. Mercy spoke to the mother first, asking if they needed water, if the child was warm enough. Then she called Flint. The dog approached with the measured calm she had trained into him, since Missouri, never rushing, never crowding, offering his presence rather than imposing it. The child turned her face from her mother's shoulder, saw the brindle dog sitting beside her with his tongue slightly out, his tail sweeping the stone floor in slow arcs. She reached out. Flint lowered his head to receive the small hand. The child's fingers found the soft fur behind his ears. She did not smile. 4-year-olds in extremity do not perform comfort, but her breathing slowed, her grip on her mother's dress loosened by 1 degree. Flint's calm radiated outward through the packed space. The horses, which should have been frantic in confinement, these tight animals that panicked in burning barns, that kicked through stall walls during thunderstorms, stood with a stillness that contradicted their nature. The dog moved among them, his body language communicating something in the interspecies vocabulary that predated human language: safety. The alpha presence was not threatening, was not fleeing, was not agitated. The other animals calibrated their responses accordingly. Hooves stayed planted. Eyes remained wide, but bodies remained still. Drummond sat near the entrance with his ledger open on his knees, recording observations by lamplight. Time of flood arrival. Estimated water height at 15-minute intervals, judged by reference points on the canyon wall opposite. Debris composition. Duration. He was documenting disaster with the compulsive precision that defined his approach to every phenomenon, measuring what could be measured, because measurement was the only tool that functioned when everything else failed. His wife sat beside him, one hand on their sleeping youngest, the other holding the lamp steady for his writing. The grinding roar persisted for 3 hours. Not constant in intensity, it surged, retreated, surged again as successive pulses of water and debris passed through the canyon's throat. Each surge brought new sounds: the crack of timber breaking under hydraulic force, the deep percussion of boulders colliding, the occasional metallic ring of iron, a stove, a plow blade, a wheel rim striking rock at velocity. At midnight, the sound began to diminish. The intervals between surges lengthened. The grinding undertone dropped in pitch, then in volume, then faded into the simpler voice of fast-moving water, without the solid freight that had given the flood its devastating character. People looked at each other in the lamplight with expressions that mixed relief with a fear that relief might be premature. No one slept. They sat against stone walls, against each other, against animals that had become furniture in the overcrowded space. Conversations began in whispers, practical questions about what came next, where to go in the morning, how to begin accounting for losses that could not yet be seen. A woman whose name Mercy did not know began crying quietly, the sound absorbed by the stone walls, the way the walls absorbed everything: heat, cold, moisture, grief. Bascom had not moved from his position against the rear wall. He sat in the deepest part of the shelter, where the ceiling lowered to 5 feet, where the lamplight barely reached. His face was in shadow. His hands hung between his knees. Once during the long night, he lifted his head to look at Mercy as she passed, carrying water. Their eyes met across the crowded space, across the distance between the woman who had built this room against universal opposition, the man who had led that opposition with the confidence of someone who believed his experience made him right about everything, because it had made him right about most things. She held his gaze without speaking. There was nothing language could add to what the canyon had already said. He had built his judgment on 13 years of success in a valley that flooded regularly but had never flooded catastrophically during his tenure. She had built her judgment on 6 weeks of watching water from a ledge after it killed her brother. His dataset was larger. Hers was more relevant. The difference between those two qualities, volume of experience versus relevance of experience, was the difference between his barn floating past in pieces below them, her walls holding steady around them. Dawn came slowly, filtered through storm clouds that were finally thinning. Gray light entered the shelter's opening, illuminating a canyon that bore almost no resemblance to the one that had existed 24 hours earlier. The valley floor was stripped. Topsoil grass, the accumulated organic layer that supported agriculture, all of it removed, leaving bedrock exposed in some areas, gravel deposits in others. The creek ran in a channel that did not correspond to any previous course Mercy had observed. Cottonwood trees were gone, not damaged, not uprooted, gone. The stumps of the largest ones remained, broken off at ground level, their trunks somewhere downstream in a debris field that might stretch for miles. Where Bascom's farm had occupied 80 acres of cultivated ground, raw stone gleamed wet in the morning light. Where the trading post had stood, a pile of logs lay scattered across a gravel bar like discarded kindling. People stood at the shelter entrance in clusters of 2-3, absorbing the visual at different speeds. Some understood immediately, their faces collapsing into the particular blankness that accompanies total loss. The mind's protective shutdown, when the gap between what was what is becomes too wide for continuous consciousness. Others took longer, searching the valley floor for landmarks, reference points, anything that connected the landscape below them to the one they had left the previous afternoon. The landmarks were gone. The reference points had been erased. The connection between yesterday's world, today's, was severed as cleanly as the flood had severed the cottonwood trunks from their roots. The marshal's grandson helped his grandparents to the entrance. The old man looked down at the valley where he had farmed for 9 years, his expression less devastated than philosophical. The face of someone who had lived long enough to understand that everything built by human hands existed at the pleasure of forces that did not consult human preferences. His wife pressed her hand against the stone doorframe. Mercy had built, steadying herself. Her fingers traced the seam where wood met rock, the joint that had held while everything below it came apart. Mercy organized the descent after the water dropped to passable levels. She led the first group down the ledge path, testing footing, clearing small debris that the flood had deposited on the lower switchbacks, confirming that the widened sections she had carved the previous year remained intact. The stone had held. Of course, the stone had held. Stone did not negotiate with water the way wood did. It simply endured, indifferent to the temporary insult of submersion, ready to resume its function the moment the water retreated. The accounting took days. Loss reports filtered through the community like a census of destruction. Bascom's total was the largest barn, house, trading post, stored crops, equipment, 30 head of cattle, 2 horses. His hired men had survived by reaching high ground independently, but their tools, their wages owed, their personal belongings were gone. Several other families reported similar devastation, complete structural loss, livestock drowned or missing, winter supplies destroyed. Before they could be laid in, nobody had died. This fact settled over the community with a weight that mixed gratitude with something more complicated. The recognition that survival without livelihood was its own category of crisis, different from death, but not as distant from it as the survivors initially felt. Drummond's stone-integrated barn had survived. Built into the rock outcropping on his elevated east boundary, designed using principles Mercy had developed, the structure came through the flood without so much as moisture on its floor. His 4 test cows stood inside it, chewing cud with the bovine indifference to historical events that defined their species. His valley barn was gone, along with the 6 comparison cows it had housed. The experiment he had designed to test Mercer's methods against conventional construction had been concluded by the flood itself, producing results more definitive than any controlled study could have generated. The stone barn survived. The wood barn ceased to exist. The data was absolute. Bascom came to the hillside shelter one final time on a morning in late August, 3 weeks after the flood. He climbed the ledge path slowly, his movements carrying the careful deliberation of a man whose physical confidence had been replaced by something more cautious. He found Mercy inside, repairing a ventilation shutter that the flood's vibrations had loosened from its frame. Flint raised his head from the doorway, recognized the visitor, lowered it again. Bascom stood in the center of the space, looking at the walls, the ceiling, the stone basin still holding water collected from post-flood rains. He touched the front wall the way he had touched it 9 months earlier, running his hand along the planking, feeling the joints, testing the chinking with his thumbnail. The craftsmanship had not changed. His ability to see it had. "You were right." The words came without preamble, without the rhetorical framing he normally applied to every statement. Raw declaration, stripped of the authority that had defined his public speech for 13 years. "I was wrong. My stubbornness nearly killed my family. It definitely destroyed everything I spent 12 years building." He paused, his hands still on the wall, his eyes focused on the wood grain as though reading something written there. "I wasn't wrong to be cautious about new ideas. I've seen too many people fail chasing plans that sounded better than they worked. Alcott, the Brennans, that family from Missouri whose name I can't remember." Another pause. When he continued, his voice carried the particular roughness of a man, speaking words he had heard but not practiced. "I was wrong to think that being cautious meant never changing. Caution should have made me examine your evidence. Instead, I used it as a reason to ignore what I didn't want to see." Mercy set down her tools. She looked at the man who had called her grief-addled, who had mobilized a community's skepticism against her, who had sat in this room during the worst night of his life, surrounded by the proof of her judgment. She felt no triumph. Being right about a flood that destroyed a community was not a victory. It was a tragedy that vindicated a precaution, the emotional equivalent of a doctor saying, "I told you about your heart," while the patient lay in a hospital bed. The canyon doesn't care who's right. Her voice was quiet, directed at the stone floor rather than at Bascom. "It just does what water does. The only choice we get is where we stand when it happens." He nodded once, turned toward the entrance, stopped at the door, his hand on the frame she had built, the triple laminated planking, the stone-seated hinges, the lock beam mechanism that connected wood to geology. "Thank you. For the warning I didn't take. For the shelter I didn't deserve." He descended the ledge path, without waiting for a response. Mercy watched him reach the canyon floor, walk south toward Coppervale, disappear around the bend where the canyon narrowed. He had already sold his flood-damaged claim to a family willing to gamble on rebuilding. He was leaving for another valley, another territory, another attempt at the permanence that Boxelder Canyon had denied him. He would carry the lesson with him, whether he applied it or buried it. Beneath new layers of conventional certainty was his choice, the only kind of choice the frontier ultimately offered. The rebuilding began in September 1883, with a collective decision that required no vote, no debate, no community meeting. Nobody built on the canyon floor. The decision was made individually, family by family, but it was unanimous, the kind of consensus that only catastrophe can produce, forged not from argument, but from the shared experience of watching everything conventional wisdom had endorsed get carried away by water that did not recognize the authority of experience. Families identified elevated positions before breaking ground, rock outcroppings, natural shelves, hillside benches where geology provided the foundation that the valley floor had proven incapable of sustaining. They walked the canyon walls with new eyes, seeing the same overhangs, ledges, caves that Mercy had cataloged the previous summer features that had been visible to everyone all along, but invisible in practice, because convention had trained people to look down, toward flat ground, toward ease, rather than up, toward stone, toward safety. Mercy consulted on every project. She walked properties with families, evaluated rock formations, discussed thermal mass principles, drainage requirements, structural integration techniques. She drew sketches on flat sandstone surfaces, the way she had drawn her own plans, charcoal on stone, the most permanent drafting medium available. She showed people how to assess caprock integrity, how to identify stable versus fractured stone, how to read the geological history of an overhang, to determine whether it would endure another 1,000 years or collapse in the next decade. She refused payment. Every family that offered money received the same response. The knowledge was not hers to sell. It belonged to the canyon, developed through necessity, refined through loss. She had paid for it with her brother's life. Charging others to benefit from that payment felt like compounding a debt that could never be settled. Drummond became the most visible advocate for what people began calling the Whitfield method. His stone-integrated barns stood as physical evidence, undamaged, functional. Its 4 test cows, producing milk the morning after the flood, while the wreckage of conventional farming drifted downstream. He opened his property to any settler who wanted to examine the structure, explaining construction techniques with the methodical thoroughness of a man who believed that knowledge transferred through demonstration rather than assertion. He showed visitors his records, the comparison data between stone barn animals, valley barn animals, the feed efficiency numbers, the health outcomes, the cost analyses. He presented facts without advocacy, letting the evidence construct its own argument the way Mercy let her walls speak for themselves. His credibility gave Mercy's methods legitimacy in contexts her own voice could not reach. Men who would not have accepted construction guidance from a 26-year-old woman listened to a 36-year-old male farmer presenting identical information through his own experience. The injustice of this dynamic was not lost on Mercy, but she recognized its utility without resentment. The goal was survival, not credit. If Drummond's voice carried her principles further than her own could, the principles still arrived at their destination. Parthenia Cobb built her new hillside shelter into a cliff face on her upper pasture, a structure larger than Mercy's original, designed for 8 cows rather than 2, with expanded feed storage, a more sophisticated water collection system, drawing from multiple rock face channels, ventilation calculated for the specific wind patterns of her site's orientation. She documented everything: materials caught, labor hours, construction sequence, performance data from the first winter in operation. Her records were meticulous, organized with the systematic attention of a woman who understood that documentation transformed anecdote into evidence, that what was written could travel further than what was spoken, that the paper trail she was creating would outlast every voice currently debating the value of her methods. Her documentation reached beyond Coppervale. A territorial newspaper correspondent passing through the settlement in the spring of 1884 wrote a brief item about the unusual architecture: stone-integrated barns built into canyon walls, a construction method developed by a woman homesteader following a catastrophic flood. The article was factual, understated, 4 paragraphs in a publication that served mining communities, cattle operations, territorial government, but it introduced a phrase that adhered to the method the way Mercy's chinking compound adhered to her planking: Whitfield-style building. The phrase appeared again in correspondence between territorial land offices, in a surveyor's report, noting unusual construction in the Boxelder drainage, in a letter from a schoolteacher in Coppervale to her sister in Denver, describing the settlement's distinctive architecture. Each usage carried the method further from its origin, detaching it from the specific woman who had developed it, attaching it to a broader concept: the idea that frontier construction could integrate with local geology rather than imposing foreign forms upon it. By the spring of 1885, Boxelder Canyon contained 12 stone-integrated structures. The settlement looked nothing like the conventional frontier community it had been 2 years earlier. Travelers passing through on the canyon rim trail commented on the architecture, with reactions that ranged from dismissal to fascination. Some called it primitive settlers living in caves, a regression to prehistoric shelter. Others recognized what the word primitive obscured: sophisticated engineering that used natural materials for structural advantage, temperature regulation, flood protection, achieving with observation what conventional construction attempted with materials alone. The two families Bascom had warned against listening to Mercy, the Paytons. The Stanfords lived in hillside shelters they had built. Following her guidance during the fall of 1883, both structures survived not only the August flood, but the spring flooding of 1884, which was substantial enough to damage the few remaining valley-level structures in the broader canyon system. The families who had been told to ignore the unconventional woman had instead built their futures on her principles. Their continued presence in the canyon, their productive farms, their healthy livestock served as a quiet correction to every dismissive word Bascom had spoken about the method, the woman. The judgment he had claimed was compromised by grief. Mercy observed the settlement's transformation with something more complicated than satisfaction. She had wanted to survive. She had wanted to protect what she could protect. She had not set out to redesign a community's relationship with its landscape, had not intended to become the architect of a building philosophy, had not planned to replace conventional wisdom with unconventional practice. The canyon had done these things through the medium of her loss, her observation, her labor. She was the instrument, not the composer. The composition belonged to geology, hydrology, the physics of stone holding heat while wood surrendered it, the mathematics of elevation, providing what foundation could not. She continued farming her modest operation through the following years, never expanding beyond what one person could manage, never hiring help, never scaling up to the commercial ambitions Bascom had insisted were the only measure of legitimate farming. Her 6 sheep provided wool she sold in Coppervale. Her 2 cows provided milk, butter, the protein that sustained daily labor. Her garden, relocated to a terraced plot on the hillside near the shelter's entrance, produced vegetables in soil she enriched annually with composted livestock waste. The operation was small. It was also entirely self-sustaining, requiring no external inputs except the occasional tool replacement, no hired labor, no debt. She owed nothing to anyone. In a territory where most operations carried credit balances, at the trading post, where drought or fluor diseases could convert a profitable year into an unpayable debt, owing nothing was a form of wealth that did not appear in conventional accounting. Drummond's operation grew. He expanded his stone-integrated facilities over the next 2 years, building additional structures into the rock formations on his property until his entire livestock operation was housed above flood level inside stone, protected by the thermal mass principles he had first measured in Mercy's shelter. His record-keeping continued without interruption, years of data accumulating in ledger books that documented what no agricultural textbook of the era addressed: the measurable economic advantages of building with geology rather than against it, feed savings, health outcomes, maintenance reduction, the compounding returns of initial investment in construction that did not depreciate, did not flood, did not require the cyclical repair that consumed so much of conventional farmers' time, money, energy. He published his findings in a letter to the Territorial Agricultural Society in 1886, a dry, number-heavy document that attracted modest interest from the small community of literate farmers who read such publications. The letter credited Mercy by name, describing her as the originator of the construction principles. His data validated. The credit was precise, specific, unglamorous. It did not tell the story of her brother's death, her solitary construction, the community's mockery, the night 17 people survived inside her walls. It simply stated that T. Whitfield of Boxelder Canyon, Colorado Territory, had developed stone-integrated livestock housing techniques that demonstrated measurable advantages in feed efficiency, animal health, structural longevity, flood resistance. The measurements followed, column after column, of figures that spoke in the universal language of arithmetic. Parthenia Cobb continued her own documentation through 1885, 1886, producing records that complemented Drummond's, with a different emphasis. Where he measured economic outcomes, she measured practical process construction sequences, material requirements, site evaluation criteria, the specific techniques for chinking, drainage, ventilation that made the difference between a functional hillside shelter, a damp cave with a wooden front, Her records became a manual of sorts, passed between families in the canyon, copied by hand for settlers in adjacent drainages who had heard about the unusual architecture, wanted to understand its principles before committing to their own construction. Women throughout the broader region began asking questions that men had been reluctant to raise. The questions were practical rather than theoretical. How much does it cost? How long does it take one person? Can I build one without hired help? What tools do I need? The answers Mercy, Parthenia provided, spoke directly to the constraints women faced on the frontier: limited capital, limited access to labor, limited social permission to undertake projects that deviated from established norms. The hillside shelter, designed by a woman working alone with no money, no help, no approval, was inherently accessible to women in similar positions. Its requirements matched their resources. Its principles assumed nothing about the builder except willingness to observe, to work, to trust stone over convention. The years between 1885 and 1889 passed with the particular rhythm of a life that had found its sustainable pattern. Mercy farmed. She consulted on construction projects throughout the canyon system, walking properties, evaluating sites, sketching designs. She maintained her hillside shelter, replacing chinking as the original compound weathered, resetting a hinge that loosened from its stone mortise after 7 years of use, carving additional drainage channels as she observed water behavior she had not anticipated during initial construction. The maintenance was minimal, confirming the long-term projections she had calculated during Parthenia's first visit. Stone did not rot. Stone did not settle. Stone did not require the endless cycle of patching, propping, replacing that consumed the weekends of every conventional barn owner in the territory. She met the surveyor in 1887. Leland Greer was 31, employed by the Territorial Land Office to map drainage systems, property boundaries, geological features throughout the canyon country. His work brought him to Boxelder Canyon, where the unusual architecture attracted his professional curiosity. He climbed the ledge to Mercy's shelter with a surveyor's interest in how the structure related to the surrounding geology, the angle of the caprock, the elevation above documented flood levels, the integral chance points where wood met stone. He returned the following week with questions that had nothing to do with surveying. They married in the spring of 1889, a quiet ceremony in the Coppervale gathering space, attended by Parthenia, Drummond, the families who had rebuilt their lives using principles Mercy had developed from loss. Leland understood the canyon the way Mercy did, as a system with operating rules that rewarded observation, punished assumption. His survey work had taught him to read landscapes the way she read wood grain, seeing the forces that shaped surfaces rather than just the surfaces themselves. They had 2 children, a daughter born in 1890, a son in 1892. Both grew up climbing the ledge path to the hillside shelter with the casual confidence of children who have never known any other approach to home. The switchbacks that had terrified visiting adults were simply the route between the canyon floor, where the garden grew, where the creek provided water, where the world conducted its horizontal business, the shelter above, where warmth lived inside stone, where the sound of rain on the caprock ceiling was the sound of safety rather than threat. The children scrambled up rock faces that would have paralyzed Eastern parents. They understood thermal mass, not as a principle but as experience, the feeling of warm stone against their backs. On winter nights, the cool of the simstone in August heat. They knew their mother's construction, the way they knew their own bodies, intimately, without the need for explanation. Mercy's health declined in the winter of 1900. The pneumonia that had killed Parthenia's husband, that had claimed lives throughout frontier communities where medical care was distant, antibiotics non-existent, arrived in her lungs in December. She fought it through January with the methodical stubbornness that had defined every challenge she had faced. Since Josiah's death, resting when her body demanded it, working when her body permitted it, refusing to treat the illness as anything more than another problem, requiring management rather than surrender. But pneumonia does not negotiate any more than flood. Water does. It occupies space that belongs to breathing. It converts function into fluid. By February, She was confined to the sleeping platform in the hillside busy shelter, the raised bed she had built in the corner. During her first winter, positioned where the thermal mass effect was strongest, where stone held warmth against her back, while fever tried to steal it from her chest. Leland cared for her with the quiet competence of a man who expressed love through precision rather than words. He monitored her temperature with the mercury thermometer, a replacement for the replacement of her father's original, the third in a lineage of instruments that connected her deathbed to Edmund Whitfield's Providence workshop. He kept the stove fed with juniper. He managed the livestock. He kept the children's routine stable, insulated from the anxiety that radiated from the sleeping platform, where their mother's breathing grew progressively more labored. Parthenia came daily, climbing the ledge path at 60 years old, with the same determination she had shown at 42. She brought food, practical help, the companionship of a woman who had recognized Mercy's value before anyone else in the canyon had been willing to look past convention. They did not discuss the illness in clinical terms. They discussed the spring garden, the lambing season approaching, Drummond's latest production figures from his expanded stone-integrated operation. They discussed the future as though Mercy would occupy it, not because either of them believed this, but because the alternative discussing the end served no purpose that either woman could identify. Mercy Whitfield died on March 15, 1901, at 44 years old. She died inside the hillside shelter she had built 18 years earlier, surrounded by stone walls that held warmth against the late winter cold, under a caprock ceiling that had sheltered her through every storm the canyon had produced since she first stood beneath it as a grieving 25-year-old with nothing except a knife, a dog, 2 sheep, the observations of a woman who had paid attention when the world gave her nothing else to do. Flint had died 6 years before her old age, his brindle coat gone white around the muzzle, his legs too stiff for the ledge path, carried up the switchbacks by Leland during the dog's final months. Mercy, he had buried him on the hillside near Josiah's grave, the 2 markers visible from the shelter entrance. The flat sandstone slab with the scratched name, the smaller stone marking the dog who had been present for everything that mattered. Leland maintained the shelter after her death. Other families occupied it periodically through the early 1900s as the canyon's population shifted, contracted, changed character. The structure required almost no maintenance. The stone components were as permanent as the geology they were part of, the wooden wall needing only the periodic chinking replacement Mercy had predicted during her first conversation with Parthenia. The door hinges she had mounted in their stone mortises functioned without adjustment for decades. The lock beam mechanism slid through its brackets with the same smooth action it had demonstrated on the night 17 people crowded inside, while the canyon below them was rewritten by water. The structure still stands, weathered, certainly the wooden planking silvered by a century of sun, wind, temperature cycling. The chinking has been replaced several times by occupants who understood the original compound's recipe or approximated it with modern materials. The stone components look exactly as they did in 1882, because stone measures time in millennia rather than decades, because the caprock that sheltered Mercy Whitfield was already ancient when she first touched it. Modern visitors who find the site, hikers on canyon trails, archaeologists surveying historic structures, the occasional descendant tracing family geography, see a wooden wall set into a sandstone overhang. Most interpret it as primitive shelter, a frontier cave dwelling that speaks of desperation rather than design. They photograph it, note it in trail journals, move on with the comfortable assumption that they understand what they are looking at. They do not see the anchor pins driven through post bases into stone. They do not see the tie planks extending into mortises, chiseled into canyon walls. They do not feel the thermal stability that keeps the interior comfortable when exterior temperatures swing between extremes. They do not understand the drainage channels carved into the floor, the ventilation calculations embedded in the shutter positions, the water collection system that turned rainfall into stored resource. They do not recognize that every element of the structure addresses a specific problem identified through observation, a specific environment, not theory applied to practice, but practice refined into principle. They do not know about the 17 people who stood inside these walls while the worst flood in canyon memory destroyed everything, built by those who trusted flat ground over high stone. They do not know about the woman who built it, the furniture maker's daughter, from Providence, who understood joints, who learned to read a canyon, the way her father read wood grain, who lost her brother to the lesson that easy ground was killing ground. They do not know that every stone-integrated structure in the canyon system traces its lineage to this single overhang, this single woman, this single act of building where survival was possible rather than where building was convenient. The canyon keeps its records in mudlines on surviving rock faces, in the geological memory of floods that shaped its walls over millennia. Somewhere in that record, unmarked by any inscription, exists the debt the canyon owes to a woman who learned its language through loss, spoke it through stone, taught it to a community that had laughed at her pronunciation until the flood made clear to you that she was the only one who had been speaking correctly. Water proved stronger than wood. Stone proved stronger than water. Knowledge of when to use which proved strongest of all.